Now, there's a long and proud tradition of activism for civil rights in the United States. It stretches back, of course, before the Civil War and then through to Martin Luther King in the 60s and those who carry his torch today. The Reverend Mark Thompson is one such activist, also a broadcaster and political campaigner. He has some radical ideas about his own country, but I thought it was pretty important that we get his perspective on recent events and we could hear them here in this country. I caught up with him via Skype from New York City earlier this afternoon and asked him firstly about the latest on protests and rioting in New York City and further afield.
Obviously, people are still out in the streets demonstrating. Most people are demonstrating peacefully. There are some elements, though, that those of us in the movement tend to be troublemakers or agents provocateurs, which are causing distractions. With all due respect, Chris, those of us in the African-American community don't use the term riot, especially when it comes to the peaceful demonstrators. We use the term rebellion because this is a reaction to what has been happening to us in America recently with the death of George Floyd and also over time. It is a total outrage here. We've not seen ongoing demonstrations like this since Dr. King was assassinated in 1968. I am grateful for you and others in the international community. We know there have been demonstrations in solidarity where you are in Australia and around the world. We are grateful for that. And I want to say, I think that those around the world may as well get prepared for what we may have to ask of them. And that is to repeat what we did during the anti-apartheid movement. If something is not changed quickly, if there is no plan to change the lynching, the ongoing lynching of our people by police and armed vigilantes soon and very soon, if that does not change, we are going to call on the world community to unify in a divestment campaign in the same way Apartheid South Africa was divested from. The world community would be asked to engage in a divestment campaign from the United States of America.
Well, that's an extreme policy response. Let's walk through that a bit if we can, Mark Thompson. First up, the violence that you touched on. This is what's so difficult for people not directly involved and people around the world to understand. Anyone who's seen that video of George Floyd being killed by a police officer will have some sense of the absolute anger and outrage of not just the Minneapolis community, but African-American communities right across your country. But how does it explode into this looting and violence on the streets that, as you say, hurts African-American communities more than others?
Well, the President of the United States wants, we believe, a civil war. He is, in many ways, promoting chaos and confusion. As I said, many of the people carrying these deeds out are not indigenous to our community. They are troublemakers. And we saw that. I invite people to go back and look at 1968. Just 10 days before Dr. King was assassinated, there was a march in Memphis, and provocateurs turned that into the type of march that some of these we see are being turned into today. And that's done to discredit and distract from the issue. We've gone from focusing on George Floyd, not to mention Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor, and David McAfee in Louisville just the other night. We've gone from focusing on that to talking about the looting and the dastardly deeds of those carrying out the looting and whatnot. But we ought to give as much more coverage to those who are peacefully demonstrating as we are those who are misbehaving.
Yeah, that's absolutely the case, because no one could disagree with the cause. No one could disagree with the fact that what happened on that Minneapolis street should never happen. And, of course, as you know all too well, has happened too many times in too many cities across the US. Why has the reaction been so different this time? Why has it been so widespread? Why has it become a national and international incident?
Well, I think it's cumulative. It has built up. And so I think finally even well-meaning whites and even some who may not have had a history of allyship with the African-American community are forever changed. They are saying, wow, this is real. African-Americans are just killed at will. And I think that is what sparked the rage. And that's why we say, with this world community in the position that it's in, with this world community marching and demonstrating with us, it's time to seriously consider a global divestment campaign.
Well, I don't seriously think that's going to happen, but we'll see what happens. A lot of this is playing into the presidential election year, of course. But I was struck today when I listened to what Joe Biden had to say when he said it's time to end racism, the racial divide in his country, to end police brutality against African Americans. I couldn't help but be struck by the fact that this man was a vice president for 2 terms to an African-American president. If no progress could have been made then, how quickly can we turn things around now?
Well, I don't fault Joe Biden for saying that. I think he's right. We need to do something about that.
Sure.
But mind you, his administration, the administration of the first black president, was also targeted by racism. And I think President Obama did what he could under the circumstances. When you're the first black president, you know, that's like being Jackie Robinson. And sometimes you have to take it on the chin in order to get things done. And I think Barack Obama did that. So there's much more that needs to be done. And one president and one administration is not going to get it done. I'm curious, though, Chris, you said you don't think a divestment campaign would work. I'm just curious, why don't you think it would work?
Well, I don't think you're going to get international agreement to have effectively economic sanctions against the US over this issue. And one of the main reasons is people would argue that the people most likely to suffer in any economic downturn might be African Americans themselves.
Well, that is what, remember now, that's what was said in South Africa, too. And yet people still took a principled position. But to your fair point, Chris, think about this. We're already suffering disproportionately from coronavirus, not just health-wise and physically, but economically. Our economy is ravaged by this. We are reliving the Great American Depression, and it's only going to get worse. So if there were not a moment, if there were ever a moment to do it, it's now, because nobody is really going to be more impacted than they are right this very minute. We're talking about private corporations. As far as governments, you know, I said divestment. In terms of government sanctions, though, that's another thing, and I'm not necessarily there yet.
Well, Reverend Mark Thompson, thanks for joining us. Hopefully we can catch up again when things settle down.
Would love to. Thank you for having me.
Reverend Mark Thompson there gives you an insight into some of the divisions in the US when you have someone talking about his own government like that, comparing it to apartheid South Africa. Now, I think that's a very extreme comparison, but the point is, when you can have African Americans killed on the street by a group of police in the way that we've seen in Minneapolis, you can understand why people feel they're not making any progress.